I think it's 4 past. I think we can start. So good morning and welcome everyone to the second webinar of the EOSC Finnish Forum. So I am Sara Garavelli and I'm the program manager for the European Open Science Cloud at CSC at the Center for Science, and I'm also the coordinator of the EOSC Finnish Forum. As you probably know, the EOSC Finnish Forum is a national initiative supported by the Ministry of Education and Culture that we launched a couple of months ago in January 2021 with the main purpose of discussing and exchanging information on the latest EOSC developments and assess their implication at national level, but also to gather collective views on the EOSC developments from a national perspective and bring them into the EOSC governance. Currently, we have around 80 members representing 24 Finnish organizations. If you are from Finland and you haven't subscribed yet, on the slide you have all the information on how to do that. Don't worry about taking notes about the links or whatever, because the slides will be available right after the webinar. But let's come to the topic of today's webinar, that is the European Open Science Cloud and the Research Data Alliance, synergies and complementarities. So why did we decide to organize this webinar? The European Open Science Cloud is a fairly new initiative with a new implementation plan. And while RDA is a pretty mature international initiative, and sometimes it is unclear for the community if and how the two initiatives are working together, how they are supporting the establishment of open science clouds, and how the community and especially the academic sector can be involved and contribute to them. So that's why we organized this webinar, and today we will try to clarify these aspects. As you see, the agenda is structured around 3 main parts. The first one is really to introducing and discussing the links between RDA and EOSC. The second part is focusing on one of the topics that is high priority in the agenda of both RDA and EOSC, and I'm talking about researchers' incentives and rewards. The third part is to contextualize some of the activities that are going on in Finland related to EOSC and RDA, and we will be closing with a final panel. I must say that I'm very happy about the agenda of today and about the speakers that we have. They are not just very good friends, but they are also really the drivers behind the EOSC and RDA developments in Europe. So please, I encourage you to take advantage of the speakers and ask them all the questions that you have. Before leaving the floor to the first speaker, I just want to remind you a couple of things. The first one is that we decided to organize this webinar now because the next RDA conference is around the corner in a month's time. And we decided in the context of the Finnish Forum to support your participation to the plenary. So we are sponsoring some free tickets to the Edinburgh plenary. Unfortunately, we cannot travel to Edinburgh, but at least we can be there virtually in a month's time. On the slide, you can see who can apply, and it's early careers and RDA supporters from Finland, and the deadline is next Monday. So you can find all the information on the application on the slide. Finally, a couple of housekeepings for this meeting today. I remind you that the meeting is recorded and we will share the recordings and the slides afterwards. If you want to interact with the speakers, and I really encourage you to do that, use the Q&A button of Zoom for your questions, the chat for your comments, and if you want to interact lively, just raise your hand. We will also have some interactive sessions with Mentimeter during the meeting, and we will give you more details when it comes the time. So let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce to you the first speaker of today, that is Hilary Hanahoe. Hilary is the Secretary General of the Research Data Alliance since 2018. She's responsible for the management of the RDA organization, for the engagement of the RDA funders, stakeholders, and organizations. And she is also responsible for the development and the stewardship of the RDA community that, if I'm correct, counts more than 11,000 members from around 150 countries. Hilary, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sara. I think you need to stop sharing so I can thank you. So first of all, thank you so much for organising this webinar, to you, Sara, and of course the Finnish Forum for EOSC. Are you seeing the correct way?
No.
Okay, now.
Yes.
Yes. So I don't know, I hope it's okay to say that Sara, of course, before this position, she says we're good friends. Sara and I had the great pleasure to work together for many, many years. And Sara has been, together with all the other colleagues on the call, actually, a huge supporter and driver of the Research Data Alliance. So, and of course, Finland has a special place in my heart for all the work that I have done over the years with CSC. And we had our last physical plenary meeting, which we hold every 6 months in Helsinki in 2019. And unfortunately, since then, we have not been able to meet face to face. But as Sara said, there's a wonderful opportunity to continue to meet with the fantastic community of the Research Data Alliance in the virtual plenary that's taking place next month. So I do hope you take advantage of that opportunity that Sara highlighted to you before. And I'll try and give you a very quick overview on the Research Data Alliance, quickly for those who don't know much about it, and then go into our support, if you like, around open science clouds or data commons. So RDA has a very grand vision of researchers and innovators openly sharing and reusing data across technologies, across disciplines and countries to address the grand challenges of society. So the concept really is, you know, at any time with any technology in any place in the world, you should be able to access and reuse and share data, which sounds simple, but is rather complex. It ties quite well into actually the European Open Science Cloud vision, which is, if you like, a similar thing, though it's not just the data, of course, that is involved in the Open Science Cloud, but we'll get to that in a moment. So to achieve this vision, the RDA mission is to build the social and the technical bridges that enable that sharing and reuse of data. And we place as much emphasis on the social as on the technical, because we clearly understand that the networking aspect, the trust, the openness, the building collaboration and relationships, and the opportunity to meet colleagues and exchange knowledge and experience and share insights is as fundamental as then coming together with the technical solutions. So as Sara mentioned, we have over 11,500 members from across the globe. Individual membership to the Research Data Alliance is free, and we have also over 60 organizational or affiliate members. Yes, so organizations can also join and become and support the Research Data Alliance. We have all the work that the Research Data Alliance does is guided by these fundamental values or principles. I always highlight them in my presentations because I think it's important for people to realize that we were built as a bottom-up international open community where consensus is key. We must be inclusive, so it's in a very inclusive, and we strive as much as possible to be inclusive in all of the work that we do, and that's in many aspects, of course, that there's harmonization, that it is community driven, so very much bottom up. Top down is important, bottom up as well, and the two have an opportunity to meet. So it's community driven and not-for-profit and technology neutral. So we try to avoid, through the mechanisms that RDA has, to avoid any sort of technological lock-in that might arise as a result of the products or the outcomes or the solutions that the community develop within the Research Data Alliance. Very quickly, the Research Data Alliance works in two main mechanisms at the moment. We have a third category coming on, but I'll stick to these for the moment. So there are two ways in which the community get together to work on these solutions. We have 97 groups at the moment running between working groups and interest groups. Working groups are very focused. They have a very clear deliverable and adoption plan for the outcomes and they can be things like code or software or guidelines or best practices. even standards, and they have a more or less an 18-month timeline. Sometimes they run slightly shorter. I'll give you an example of one in a moment, and sometimes longer. And then we have interest groups, which are more broad and open for the discussion around activities where it's not really clear the focus, or there are many, many aspects to define. And so they can either spin off into working groups or create their own outcomes. Yes, and we have over 50 flagship outputs in the Research Data Alliance, and we know of about 150 adoption cases. Because it's so open and everything is accessible, it's not always easy to document that. But I want to give you a very quick example, unfortunately a bit of a pertinent one, to an example of how this works. So of course, with the COVID pandemic last year, we made a call to action to our wonderful community, and it was a very large, very intense cross-disciplinary effort. Yes, so I talked at the beginning about the building bridges. If you see on this slide here, we had the clinical, omics, epidemiology, and social sciences disciplinary areas working with these underlying more transversal areas of community, of research software, of indigenous data guidelines, and legal and ethical considerations. And members from and experts, both data, but also, you know, clinical or epidemiological clinicians and things like that, came together in the space of 3 months and created a very, very important set of data sharing guidelines around COVID-19 data, which we were published in June last year. So I know it's hard sometimes to conceptualize what the Research Data Alliance does, but this is a very practical example. Those guidelines, together with a wizard to navigate them, etc., are all available openly on the website, and a huge Zotero resource collection as well. So this is an example of how RDA works, and it was particularly, I said 18 months for the working groups. This was a series, 8 different working groups coming together, coordinated in a very intense way, and they did this within the space of 3 months, but that's very unusual, and it was to respond to the pandemic. So, of course, we are a global organization. We have strong roots in Europe for a long period since our launch in 2013. I have to say that the moderator of our panel, Leif Laaksonen, was one of the founders of the Research Data Alliance in Europe, and the drivers, and CSC were the original driving organization behind the Research Data Alliance. So everything always comes full circle, and it's really wonderful that 7 years, 8 years on, we're still here, and the success of RDA is very much due to the people who had the vision at that time. So Leif and CSC were very grateful for that. What I wanted to highlight here was, of course, that you know, our global contribution to the European Open Science Cloud, to the, you know, focus and the priority for Europe, and particularly the European Commission, but also the member states at the moment, is that open solutions can be implemented across multiple European stakeholder organizations. No, as we have many examples of adoption of our outputs. And what I'd like to highlight is, of course, that in the proposal, the European Commission's partnership around the European Open Science Cloud was the strong statement that the Research Data Alliance is recognized as an actor in the development of standards and good practices for managing research data, and that this is, of course, a contribution that the Research Data Alliance can make to the European Open Science Cloud. I'm not sure, those of you who are here with us today, how well you know the European Open Science Cloud. What I know is that it means different things to different people. There are many different ideas around it, and of course, all the different stakeholders come to the table with a different perspective. But I mean, this is the sort of, if you like, the objectives tree that they had, but I think most one of the things that is important to RDA, and is why I say that both of them tie so closely together, is that the Open Science Cloud ideally will make available in a seamless as possible way to those who need to the end users, data, resources, compute, and all different and services, so that this multidisciplinary access and people can access data, share data, make it available in the, in the right context. And of course, it shouldn't be in isolation in Europe, and it's a global endeavor. So this is the objective tree, if you see. So there are sort of people, data, and infrastructures. And RDA has many, as I said, 97 groups. I highlight here some of the groups, just an example of them that can support, in fact, those barriers that can help to achieve the objectives that the European Open Science Cloud has set for itself. And as Sara said, we'll be sharing the slides. So this is just an example that was created last year of the different groups and how they map to many of the projects and activities in Europe that are going to build this ambitious but achievable, I believe, Open Science Cloud in Europe. So what do we do? I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the global aspect. RDA has two specific activities taking place at the moment. All of our groups are open for people to join. Joining means contributing, but it also means listening and learning. We have the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group and Working Group, and their goal is to support coordination amongst regional, national, pan-national and international and domain-specific organizations. Because if we are to achieve, science is global, it's not particularly, doesn't always have geographical boundaries. So what's created in Europe and in other places in the world would be much better if it was interoperable, rather than building it in isolation. So these are two groups that are working at the moment around this. There is a project starting up in Europe at the moment in which RDA is involved. It's called EOSC Future, and we'll be looking specifically at engaging with research and science communities, particularly with those that are less aware and prepared, shall we say, to engage with the European Open Science Cloud, and also to help with the social technical alignment, excuse me. We will, another piece of work, of course, is to ensure this synchronization and the research assessment registry, which is a piece of the work that needs to be in this rather large global idea of open science commons, and incentivize. That's more on the incentives and rewards around research assessment, and Catriona and MacCallum will talk about that initiative afterwards. And lastly is the international standards. Of course, RDA has a mechanism in Europe particularly to create its technical specifications or standards, and that is an area in which we would like to support. At the moment, we have a project running RDA for EOSC, which is funded through an open call with the EOSC Secretariat. It has 5 main objectives. I won't talk about them because I've come on over my time. And the next speaker is Timea Biro, who is working on, from the Digital Repository of Ireland, who's working on that initiative, will give you more insight into that. Of course, this is setting the stage for the other work that I talked about before with the EOSC Future. So to leave you with sort of a takeaway message, of course, knowledge sharing is a key mechanism to spreading good practice now, and openness, trust, learning from others, and given the guiding principles of the Research Data Alliance, we feel that it is an excellent forum for people to get involved in whatever way you wish. You may come and observe, may come and contribute, you may be a driver, and you will hear from some of them, including Asmi afterwards, who was the chair of some groups in RDA and his experience around it. So with that, I will stop and say kiitos, and thank you very much for your attention, and pass the floor to Timea.
Thank you very much, Hilary. So I suggest we move to the next speaker. As Hilary said, is Timea Biro, project manager at the Digital Repository of Ireland. Timea did several work related to connected to the DRI's various contributions to the Research Data Alliance, and she's currently focusing on the support RDA is providing to the European Open Science Cloud. Timea, please.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, yes.
Brilliant. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm Timea Biro. I work for the Digital Repository of Ireland, and in the next few minutes, I'm going to talk to you about one of the activities that Hilary has mentioned, so the co-creation initiative called RDA for EOSC, and specifically we're going to focus on the support that RDA is providing from the disciplinary and organizational engagement point of view. As some of you might know, in the landscape, the report on the EOSC landscape and related initiatives and infrastructures that was released last year, it says that the EOSC is the European Open Science Cloud is the result of two complementary movements. One is community-driven and the second one is multi-governmental. Now, a lot of the focus in the recent time has been given to the multi-governmental approach, and that makes a lot of sense for various reasons that I'm not going to get into. Of course, the Finnish Forum can play an important part on that side as well. But for the next minutes, if I'd like us to stop and look a little bit about the community-driven movement and how that connects to the work that RDA is doing, because this is an area where organizations like RDA really show their value. And this is also an area where researchers and research support staff like yourselves, either individually or collectively, and the organizations that you represent can play an important role. These were the questions that we were actually asking ourselves when setting up this activity. So how do institutions, organizations engage with EOSC? What are the areas that they should be working on to align? And the same thing for the communities. What are actionable things that they can do going forward to make sure that the progression and connection to the EOSC is a seamless one? I will start with the research communities, the EOSC and the RDA, and in order to understand the relationships and the dynamics of this, we are currently performing a study that is mapping the state of awareness and readiness of various domains and disciplinary communities, because engagement at the end is about awareness and is about readiness levels. So we've done an initial mapping of the levels of engagement. We defined a set of indicators that would help us understand how aware and ready these communities are. These indicators are focused on social enablers and technical enablers, and Hilary mentioned earlier that it's all about the social and the technical bridges that are being built. It's all about the social and the technical alignment. So from the social point of view, we have looked at roadmaps, training and skills that are available, and consolidated initiatives that support these communities. And from the technical point of view, we've looked at infrastructure, registries and catalogs that support the federation, and standards and vocabularies that support our base for the interoperability. So the goal again will be to support the work going forward by understanding which are underrepresented communities, but also which are successful ones for benchmarking. And hopefully the work needed will be taken forward by the RDA communities of practice that are currently being set up, and projects like the one that Hilary has mentioned, RDA Futures. The study that we're doing is still ongoing, but I would like to share a few initial notes with you and a couple of next steps, just to highlight how you can get engaged, and what can you expect from this initiative from the point of view of the research community's engagement. So a lot of the things are very in-depth. And we'll try to explain these a lot better in the report itself. But just to highlight, it it is not a surprise that the more engaged communities come from the ones that are were built around the ESFRI clusters, but their strengths differ. So they have focused on different things such as federation, the diversity of the services that they offer, or have a very strong component focused on training and skills. Natural sciences, and especially the environmental and biological ones, have the most data catalogs that are available on the EOSC portal marketplace, and also the highest number of the services for data management, processing, and analysis. I'm not going to go through all the points, but I would like to highlight that based on our initial assessment, some of the underrepresented communities that we're going to try to focus more over the upcoming period come from renewable energy, so wind energy, material sciences, chemical sciences, and biodiversity. And these are communities that the RDA has had several interactions with and has a good history. So there is a strong connection there that we can build upon. And a different type of sort of underrepresented communities are the librarians, the archival and the information sciences, and also the public sector, government data, and sustainable development goals communities. And these are not for lack of awareness, because these are communities that have long been involved in this, in the research area, but these are most commonly non-scientific large data sources that are of interest for the research and should be taken into consideration and looped into this initiative. So for the next steps, we are looking at collecting additional insights from other community representatives, and we will publish the recommendations and the success stories that hopefully will come of use for not only the underrepresented communities, but also research communities in general. In the meantime, like our advice is to join the RDA groups that are of interest to you, also from a disciplinary point of view, because most likely someone has either dealt or is dealing with the similar challenges that you have, and there's strength in addressing them together. And also consider the communities of practice that are being set up. From the organizational point of view, so we have looked at how RDA can support its organizational and regional members, and for that we have tried to understand which are the areas that that organizations should be looking at, which are the focus areas for them in order to ensure the engagement with the EOSC. And we've done an initial scoping with RDA organizational members. You can see the figure there is a result of their answers, and we're currently collecting interviews with additional more specific perspectives from them. The output would be a series of policy briefs and coordination webinars that would help the alignment work that is ongoing. Based on the initial scoping and the interviews that we have run, we sort of narrow it down to three major areas that the organizations need to address or are addressing and tackling in terms of the engagement with the EOSC. The first one, and probably the most challenging, regards policy alignment. Then we have the buildup of the capacity building around support activities such as training and data stewardship. And then there's also the various components like PIDs, repositories, DMPs, and a growing concern for metrics, assessment, and compliance. Just to highlight a little bit the issue regarding the policy alignment, because that's also the topic of the first policy brief that we're gonna publish. A lot of the organizations have highlighted the fact that they found it challenging to align their internal organizational policies if they regard open access, research data management, IPR, and ethics, and also to align at other levels, the organization, disciplinary, the national one, which often brings forward legislation and funder policies, and also the EOSC level. So, and I'm happy that Anders is here with us. Himself and his colleague Hannah in their interview have actually highlighted this as one of the challenges that they have at national level. So aligning policies and interests of the various universities that they're coordinating and working with, together with the other levels that they need to address. But there are advancements in this area. So there are initiatives that support alignment through core elements, and I'll just mention the work that Science Europe is doing and Fair's Fair. And there's also the Fair Data Maturity Model that is an RDA group that provides support from this point of view. Going forward, we hope that you'll find the policy briefs that we're developing very useful, and we welcome you to our upcoming webinars on these topics, as well as our interviews. To close, hopefully on a positive note, we need to see the engagement in the EOSC either at disciplinary or at organizational level as a journey. So it's a question about building awareness and capacity, and there are multiple bridges that need to be crossed. We always use the metaphor of the bridges, because RDA, as Hilary said, is building the social and technical bridges to support this type of work. So forums like RDA can support you either at individual level or at the organizational ones, and connect you to data commons and the EOSC. This is it for me. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them on. If not.
Thank you very much, Timea. I think that, this work will be really important for the future engagement activities that will be organized, especially in the EOSC context, because there are big discussions around how to improve the engagement with the communities and the organizations. So that's a really good input for them. When will the study be ready?
So the study and most of the policy briefs and the webinars are set to close by the end of May. So over the upcoming months, initial releases of the policy briefs and also some of the things on the report will be made available through the RDA. Okay.
So I don't see any questions in the Q&A and in the chat. And as we are slightly late, so my suggestion is that we move on with the next topic. And if you have any questions for Hilary or Timea, please add them to the Q&A button. So let's move to the second part of the agenda that is focusing on researchers' incentives and rewards. And the first speaker is Catriona MacCallum. She's director of the Open Science at Hindawi. She's also on the steering committee of DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, and she was a member of the European Commission Open Science Policy Platform and the UK ERI Open Access Practitioner Group. She has a lot of experience in scholarly publishing and in open access publishing. So again, please take advantage of her presence here. We are very pleased to have you, Catriona. Please, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak to you today. It's the issue around global alignment and working together is just so important. And I think the RDA and EOSC have a huge role to play in that as well. So can you see my screen? And
yes.
Are you okay? So I'm here to talk about the Global Research Assessment Registry. And this is, I'm speaking on behalf of a small steering committee of which Hilary is a member. And in fact, these are Hilary's slides from last week at a EC Open Science Assembly meeting, and talking about the initiative. so what I want to do is to just give you a bit of the background about this and what the intent for it is. It's still at a really, really early stage, but I think it epitomizes that sort of community-based working together. It's a project that will not work unless different stakeholders come together and support it. So the origins of this idea came from the Open Science Policy Platform. I was on that representing the Open Access Publishers Association, OASPA, and there were many other stakeholders, including the RDA, on that. And in the final report, which was published in May 2020, one of the recommendations was to call for pilots and implementations around responsible metrics. And in particular, the recommendation from the 26 stakeholder members of the OSPP was to create an open science registry of pilots and implementations to inspire best practices and new assessment mechanisms to support open science. I think the basis of this was that there was essentially just a real need. This is a completely new area. We don't know the sorts of incentives and rewards and practices that work best for both science, researchers and society and the institutions. And the basis of this was almost to take a sort of almost experimental approach. Of course, this has to sit in a much wider landscape. There are many, many different organizations, initiatives around responsible metrics and how open science practices might be evaluated. Finland has been a key part of this as well. There's various expert reports have come out of the EC as well, including things like the Open Science Career Assessment Matrix and different matrix and the evaluation of research careers, plus Paul Wooter's work on open science metrics. And so the idea of the research assessment registry is not to try and reinvent the wheel or to repeat what others are doing, or but it's to try and bring information together, to create a central resource to help promote an open, collaborative and evidence-informed approach to potential incentives and rewards for open science. Because essentially in this world, and we're all tackling with this transition, we actually don't know what works where and when. And the key stakeholders for such a resource would be those who are able to actually create and produce the information and potential data. And these are going to be governments, funders, RPOs, and other institutions like yourself, which are actually trying to implement cultural change in your organizations to incentivize open science and embed it within the culture of the institution and research practice in general. And the other key stakeholders are those who would use it, which are the same organizations, but they're also independent researchers doing research on research itself, publishers, advocates, open science advocacy groups, NGOs, citizen scientists, anyone who is essentially interested in seeing the potential of open science realized in their context. And the aim, and remember this is still really at the concept stage, the aim is to create a searchable database of policy interventions and practices in multiple contexts. And the idea is to just be able to aggregate that information, but to be able to support and search filtering for multiple use cases and at very different levels, depending on the context that might be helpful for a particular users. So you might want to locate information about different approaches depending on discipline, jurisdiction, the location, the study size, the organization type, perhaps the cohort you're targeting. It might be for early career scientists or senior scientists or more the sort of teaching community, or maybe just for those supporting data stewardship. there could be all sorts of different interventions and different policies that are introduced. But the key essential part of this that we think is different from other approaches being developed around best practice all around the world is this evidence-informed approach. So we want to be able to get access to the policy documents, the data, and other resources relating to the implementation of that policy and how the outcomes, how it was tracked, and what the outcomes were. And the idea is to be completely agnostic to what is in this database. What we're hoping for is that organizations will share information. It's not going, will want to share information, and they'll share the things that both work and don't work in different contexts. So we can see outcomes that perhaps don't have the impact that they were perceived or they were intended to have in a particular situation or context, as well as those ones that do, because things that work in some contexts might not work in others, but things that might not work in some contexts might also work in others. So it's the ability for stakeholders to learn about those policy changes and the implementation. And another thing is to also enable that qualitative and quantitative data, because it's not just quantitative, it's not just about metrics and proxies, it's about that qualitative storytelling side of culture change to be sort of independently analysed by a third party or aggregated across similar policy initiatives. And we think this is important because it also allows some objectivity around how research assessment is evolving. And initially, the focus will be on interventions that incentivize open research behavior and practice. But ultimately, when open science is just science and when it's all embedded, we hope one day, it will just be, it could be expanded to record the consequences of any policy changes to any aspect of research assessment, but to maintain that sort of evidence-informed basis. And the idea is to support the alignment of open research practice and policies between funders and institutions. And this speaks very much to the policy alignment that everyone is calling out for and is so difficult. And without that policy alignment, it ultimately puts researchers in a desperate position of conflict. If funders say one thing to them, their institute is measuring them on another thing, and actually they're applying for an international job somewhere else, which has yet a different set of criteria. But the idea is actually to share these practices, which we hope will actually catalyse innovation and further reform in research assessment, and provide a sort of a context for the development of different types of open research indicators and benchmarks across different stakeholder groups. And again, this is very much focusing on the qualitative as well as the quantitative. So what is it? It's a mutual learning and knowledge exchange platform. So in some ways, it's very tied in with the mission and vision of the RDA itself. It's global, it's completely open, and it's community driven. We need this to be owned by the stakeholders who are going to benefit most from it. It is not a monitoring platform, and it is not an evaluation framework. This is not a means to assess how your institution is doing against the world. There are so many different circumstances, and there are some institutions which just do not have the resources, especially outside Europe, or the context to support an open science infrastructure or to support different research assessment. And it's not about sort of ranking institutions or funders, because we want funders to contribute to this. It's really about sharing knowledge. And so how will this be sustained? And at the moment, we're putting in grants. So we are putting in a grant there's a Wellcome Trust Open Research Fund at the moment, which could provide part of the money. The EC have committed to a small amount of money again, but that's to be finalised. And the RDA actually has some money as well. And we will need a combination of money, because just the research and design to go into something like this, to make it flexible, to provide that context dependence and searchability, and to make it useful for funders and institutions and others, is that co-creation is going to take time. Ultimately, we're going to need a longer term sustainability plan. This is not something that the current members of the steering committee are going to take forward. This needs to be owned by the community and by the key stakeholders involved. So what are the next steps? So at the moment, we're at the funding stage. Then we're going to go into research and design, which will involve a sort of deep dives of stakeholder consultations, and making sure that we've got key partnerships right at the beginning, because there are organizations like DORA and like the Leiden Manifesto and all over the world these are, which we need to tie in. We don't want to be either taking money away from these organizations or replicating the work they're doing, but complementing it. And then there's going to be a scoping, design and implementation phase. A huge part of this will be raising awareness of the resource, and hopefully we will try and go and essentially do a survey out there of what's publicly available, but we hope it will also inspire institutions and funders to make more information publicly available via this resource. So there's going to be a lot of advocacy and a lot of communication and outreach. We had an initial roundtable already. Well, we've had a couple of meetings. One was at the RDA plenary to sort of get people's input into the concept. Another was where we actually got funders and institutions, largely from Europe and the States, together to flesh out what sort of information they would like. And we put them into groups of institutions and funders, and we basically said to the institutions, what information would you want from a registry like this, from other institutions? And we said the same to funders. So it wasn't about what institutions wanted from funders or funders wanted from institutions, it's what institutions would like to see shared by other institutions. And we came up with a list of almost 60 different use cases. And these are a couple of examples. And of course, they're incredibly broad. See how other universities decide on promotion and tenure for their staff. Breaking that down and being able to structure that information so it was useful for people is a large research task. A funder perspective was encourage researchers to share all their research outputs to help ensure our funded research is trustworthy and reproducible. What came out of this workshop is that it needs to be really, really flexible, because initially our concept was perhaps more restrictive, and we've changed that directly based on the feedback already. But also what came out was this real need to have information. Many of the institutes and funders here are at the very, very progressive end of looking at research assessment. But they were acutely aware that although they wanted information, there wasn't a huge motivation to share information at the moment. And so part of this resource is going to try and also identify the incentives and benefits that will enable institutes and funders to share that information about what works and what doesn't work safely. And of course, unless there's alignment between funders and institutions and government and publishers and other stakeholders, that's not going to be possible. So we really need to create that community environment where taking risks, sharing data, in some ways, what we ask of researchers actually within open science, it is done at the sort of higher institutional and funder level. So very briefly, these are the steering committee at the moment. These are people who were on the OSPP, but we also linked up with DORA, although they're not formally submitting a grant, and Michelle Barker from the Research Software Alliance as well, Vanessa Proudman from Spark, Hilary, you know, Anna Hatch from DORA, Rebecca Lawrence from F1000. But these, we are just a bunch of volunteers trying to sort of bring this idea together. In the longer term, you know, we want to get this off the ground, but we will not own it, we will not sustain it. And in fact, the RDA hosting this, supporting this, getting funding this is a perfect place for that community discussion to start around it. So just to leave you with a couple of thoughts is one of the things we're all struggling with is what does excellence mean in this new world? What does high quality research and high quality research practice mean? We know it's not publications. We know that, but we don't actually know what it is. And it's going to be different in different contexts. And how will we know what works and what doesn't? Unless we can learn from each other. And that's the whole point of the resource and the registry. And I just want to you know, if we start to fiddle around the edges and change little metrics, it's not going to work. We need to really, and it's going to take time and possibly years. And this was from Jörn Gertz last week on the Dutch initiative, Room for Everyone's Talents. And I really like the message he sent. Defining the criteria too early changes the rules. We can't predict the metrics and indicators that will work. And if we do that too early, we'll change the rules, but not the game. And the aim for all of us is to change the game. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catriona, for your presentation. There is a question for you in the chat. We can go back to that after the next talk. So maybe in the meantime, you can have a look. So I would like to pass the floor to the next speaker. This is Henriikka Mustajoki from the Federation of Finnish Learned Societies. So Henriikka is the head of the Development Open Science in Finland, and she has also been a member of the EOSC Sustainability Working Group. Henriikka, please.
Lovely, thank you very much. Checking, all good with sharing the screen?
Yes, fine.
Excellent, thank you very much for the invitation to share in this webinar today. I'm really kind of looking at the other half of what Catriona so successfully shared with us as the first part of this section, which is really about a complementary part to what the registry could be. What I'm really presenting is a deliverable of an EOSC co-creation project that we have hosted at the Federation of Finnish Learned Societies, and they relate to a fair assessment. Now, I guess Catriona already kindly shared that we seem to agree globally and definitely within Europe, there's a need to reform our assessment structures. We have plenty of policy work, and the importance of that is significant. There is specific calls for need to reward fair data practices. We can never look at these completely in isolation from other types of assessment, but specifically if we want to increase the production of fair data, we need to also make sure that is visible in our assessment changes. We know RDA has already been doing work on that, just like EOSC is been doing work on that. So the nexus between the different types of work that's already been done is an important to capitalize on. But when we look at making change, I think this triangle is a good way of looking at it. We need to make sure we capitalize on all the steps. Just doing some is not going to take us to the end, but we need all of them. The focus so far, which has been an important place to start, is to be looking at the policy level, about the incentives and about the community. And we have achieved so much in our international collaboration. We're not there yet, but the ideas of what we want assessment to be and to include is emerging. And there is convergence on understanding and sharing and going, like, this is the direction we want to take assessment. So we need to look at the normative, make it rewarding and making it required. So that work is well underway, and the registry that Catriona shared will be an important element of strengthening that part of making the change into reality. But we know so far, even though we've been talking about this for quite some time, there is quite small steps in changing, for example, how open science features in assessment. And being an open science national coordinator, I'm particularly looking at the open science area in the assessment development, but all parts obviously link to each other. EUA has done a recent survey. I'm sure we'll get results of that soon, but my understanding is that while we've made progress, a major leap still waits to happen. And when we're wondering what is missing, what part of the process could we now work on to make sure we get the change happening? So what we came to focus on this project is infrastructure. That while we work on the policies and incentives and communities, we need something that supports that. We need data to support our responsible assessment. So when we looked at this from a fair data perspective, we have quite good understanding of what we mean by responsible assessment. We have national policies and recommendations. In Finland, we've got one. The Dutch one, Making Room for Everyone's Talent, is very popular. We know Norway is close to publishing theirs. And we've done a lot of work on making it rewarding. We've talked about the diversity of the outputs and activities and the missions. We've drilled down into understanding what parts of FAIR principles could be part of this particular type of rewarding. What the gap we've identified is the making it possible. That we need data in order to change our assessment practice. And we need good quality data. We need data that travels between organizations and countries that is actually providing support to how we understand the responsible assessment. It's very hard to change the assessment system if the only data we've got available is the same data that the old system had available. And we know we are very good at collecting data on publications. So it's not a surprise that publications then are the things that have featured so heavily in our assessment system. I'm sure there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing happening there, but if we are serious about changing our assessment culture, we need to support that desire with quality data. And we need infrastructures in collecting that data. For example, if we look at their data production, at the moment, to be able to provide evidence that you have provided fair data is scattered among multiple repositories. It's very hard for both the researcher to collect that information, and it's very hard for those who are doing the assessment to be able to verify and look into that assessment, let alone when we move into the use of their data, not just the production of it. Where do we gather reliable data that covers what we actually want to assess? So we need to start building fair assessment infrastructure. So we need, it needs to support assessing academic activities. It needs to kind of look into that. We've got some existing infrastructures capturing publishing efforts, and we need to complement that. And we need to look at data production and sharing, data use, teaching elements, other types of social engagement. And all this is already in our policy document. And we need to get that data to support us putting that policy into practice. We need to look, there's a lot of talk about narrative CVs. We need to look, how can we bring those into it? Science Europe has, in their position paper, really pointed out that we need to focus on minimizing data re-entry and maximize data reuse. Obviously, here we run into GDPR and elements that we would need to carefully consider in how we do this. Also, we might want to capture rewards, prizes, and other accolades in the infrastructure infrastructure. So the policy development, I think Catriona talks about that, the Commission talks about that. We need memorandums of understanding and vision on these policies. We need that national, organisational, international policy development. We need these platforms as the registry to be able to do the harmonisation work. And we need to really work on terminology on what we mean in different parts of the policy. But when we look at the infrastructure, we really need international focus and funding to start building the technical solutions, the interfaces and the structure, how this data could be gathered and then shared in different assessment events. And we call it fairer assessment infrastructure. It's fair and responsible. That's where the second R comes from. And we've identified some elements that it needs to have. We need some PIDs and some shared data models. It's a major work in itself to build those data models. We need to use existing infrastructures but not be restricted by them. We need to design a system that provides different levels of access for different types of users, particularly from the GDPR perspective. We need to incorporate consent from researchers for the data to be gathered in this particular way. And we need to look at minimizing assessment data re-entry and maximize the reuse. And then we need to look into establishing a forum for the dialogue between different types of professionals working in assessment. And we need open science and evaluation experts that look into what are the content, what are we actually wanting to capture. We need to talk with the researchers, the data stewards, the research software engineers. So we need to create that. And I'm just wondering, when we are collecting the registry, can we kind of come up with a dynamic system with the RDA and the EOSC to create these forums where the building of the infrastructure is appropriately supported by the entire community. So if we take one takeaway from my short presentation, is that we need data to assess responsibly. And we need to start envisioning how we can collect that data and utilize that data responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henriikka. So I think we have a few minutes for a couple of questions, and maybe I would like to start from the question that we have received in the Q&A, and it's for Catriona. How you can take into account time? So short-term consequences might differ from long-term consequences. Should the cases be updated for quite many years?
Yes. I mean, in some ways, this is just like any other research program. And you know, when you think about the long-term impact of the impact factor, you know, if we knew at the start when we started using it what the long-term impact factor is, if we were able to track and monitor at different time points what the consequences on the entire research culture system was, you know, hopefully we'd have stopped earlier. but so I think time is a huge important, and also this is I think this is something as well, because it's not, this registry is not something that can be filled immediately with success stories. It's not going to happen. Some of these things are deeply embedded, and cultural change takes time. And so some of the policy changes might take 5-10 years to see any consequences. Others might take 2 years. So ideally, having different timescales and outcomes that we can match to an initial policy change, perhaps at different time points, would certainly be part of that. I think we have to capture that. As Henriikka says, you know, we need the data about research assessment in order to do it responsibly, and that data takes time to generate, and the outcomes to be analysed. And yeah, I think that's really important.
Okay, thank you. And maybe I would like to ask to both of you one other question, because in both your presentations, I think that you highlighted how important and key is the active involvement, engagement of different stakeholders. And so the question is, do you see any shift in responsibilities in the future to build this assessment registry compared to what's happened in the past? And how could be the best way to coordinate and engage the stakeholders in this effort?
Yeah, no, it's hugely important and it's really difficult. It was really interesting last week at the EC Open Science Assembly, because it was I've forgotten his surname, Rick from University of Amsterdam and others were talking about how they got that community engagement in the Netherlands, so that you had stakeholders working together. And and I think the EC has absolutely really acknowledged this, because what they're talking about is, in some respect, you do need a top-down. You do need some kind of memorandums and MOUs and to get things going. But if you don't have the engagement of the institutions and the other organisations and RPOs that are actually dealing with researchers, dealing with assessments, dealing with international collaboration, and all that entails, it's not going to work. You have to have them. And so there may be a time where you start off with, and I think Rick talked about, there's a sort of, you need that top-down guidance. You need funders and governments to be aligned. And then at some point, but you really need that bottom-up as well. And then the institutes themselves at some point have to take over and take ownership and help lead this. So I'm not an expert, so I'm giving you his answer, but I'd be very interested to hear Henriikka's.
I guess in Finland, being a small country, it's been relatively easy to create that. But I think internationally, we already have the forums in place where we can have these conversations. We have RDA, the EOSC new advisory group. There's one on assessment. And then at the same time, we know that research performing organizations and research funding organizations are themselves in their own collectives having this conversation. So we are simultaneously having this assessment conversation now in absolutely all the right forums. And having forums like the Commission meeting last week are those convergent points of saying, are we double checking? Are we having the same conversation? So I'm really hopeful that we now have the positive momentum, because the number of different types of conversations we're simultaneously having is taking place. And really important, I think, is the organizations that do the assessment to have the majority of the voices in that conversation, which is research performing and funding organizations. So I call for all universities and funding bodies and for us that are already in that to actively pull them in whenever we can into the conversation, because they are the ones that will make it happen. And we need to have that voice. And for us in the positions that I'm in, it is really my responsibility to have those invitations constantly to make sure we get the engagement happening. But I'm really, really optimistic that the time has come for this cultural change to happen. The will and want and participation is now there.
May I add a comment to that? Because absolutely, and I think Europe, it's a really exciting time. I won't talk about the UK, but it's a really exciting time to be part of Europe, and Europe is really leading in this area. So I think the next worry is, how do you have that global conversation? How do you not disadvantage researchers that are either coming in from different countries with different practices of assessment, or disadvantaging ours that are going and collaborating with those countries. But my understanding is that EOSC and the Commission and others, the first step will, okay, what can we do within Europe, but as soon as possible to start having those conversations, so there isn't the competitive disadvantage placed on either institutions or researchers.
Okay, I would like to thank you both very much for your presentations and your comments. There is another question in the chat, so maybe you can answer it directly in the chat, because now it's time to break for a coffee. So we will be coming back at 12:25. so in almost 12 minutes. So I'll see you there in a while. Unless, Catriona, you want to comment break. So
yeah, no, I did accidentally just, I think, press the answer, but I hadn't answered the question. But just to respond to that question, if we only have best practices, how will we know what the best practices are if we don't have all practices? And if we only wait for the best practices, we might have to wait 5 or 10 years. So, you know, I think we need to start sharing immediately all practices, and not, you know, there will be concerns about things that might go wrong or not things, but if everyone's doing it, hopefully there'll be a motivation and a curiosity about what works and what doesn't. Okay, I'll let you go for your break. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye-bye.
So, I think we are ready to start again. We are now moving into the third part of the agenda. That will be really focusing on giving you an overview about the activities that are going on in Finland about RDA and EOSC. So the first speaker for this third part is Asmi from University of Helsinki. He is a research coordinator at the Institute of Atmosphere and Earth System Research. He's a specialist in environmental research infrastructures management, particularly in data issues, policies, and community building. He's co-leading the ENVRI FAIR cluster project, and he has a very long-lasting experience in RDA. So Ari, please go ahead.
Thank you. Just a second, I'll try to share my presentation. So, okay, and okay, I hope this one works now.
Perfect.
So it's my title of the presentation is RDA, EOSC, and ENVRI, and I mean this came to my mind that there's a lot of acronyms related, but of course you already heard about a lot of these. But what I want to maybe present here is some of my own experiences and really my own perspective on these aspects. And these are of course only my opinions and not really representations of University of Helsinki or ENVRI or basically anybody else either. So I'm just going to talk about this, a very short one, so briefly about me and these other initiatives which were mentioned. So first of all, I have a PhD in atmospheric physics, and during that time I started to get really annoyed about the poor availability and quality of data, research data in my own field. And after working for a while with the ENVRI projects, with the infrastructures, which were actually because of this, I started to work on the infrastructures. I started to make things better. I noticed that management also is another thing which starts to annoy me. And now I also have a EMBA on research infrastructure management partly for this reason. And as was mentioned, I'm currently co-coordinating ENVRI FAIR Horizon 2020 project. So just briefly about my main job, and which kind of gives you a little bit of motivation why I work with these ones. I work for the ENVRI community, which is a community of research infrastructures in Europe. And so what we have here is quite a large number of infrastructures. They are all individually very large. Each one of those little logos in the bottom of the screen, they all have a membership from at least 3, but usually up to maybe 10 or 15 member states. And of course, they're the research performing organizations. And so this community is very large in that sense. It also connects quite closely to their own research communities. And what is typical for environmental research, they provide a lot of data, which is you can't repeat, and usually very big data sets as well. And they are very dynamic, meaning that they change all the time and you have new versions coming in. And so what is also interesting about research infrastructures is that they're naturally very long lasting, they have long-term vision. And in this case, they are very European. And so in the left side of the screen, you can see here, I try to put a little bit of like traffic lights that they are very close to domain scientists, to my experience. They have some specialized resources and abilities in computing and data storage, but they are usually very specialized in a sense for their own purpose. And for global view, they are usually European. And I mean, the ENVRI itself is European. And of course, some of them are more global in the view, but in general, they are concentrated in Europe. So if we come to another one, which was just from my own perspective, how I use Research Data Alliance, is that because of this concentration in the Europeanness, Research Data Alliance gives a really good way of getting out of not only from the environmental field point of view, but also of the international point of view. And of course, the challenges are to participate is that you need your own funding there. And I also sometimes find it a little bit challenging that I would call it super interdisciplinary, because it goes beyond all kind of scientific boundaries, which makes sometimes communication a little bit challenging, but I think things are improved a lot. And actually Leif introduced me to this one and asked me to come to the very first RDA meeting. Since then, I've been a lot of connected to this. And there's two work, just to explain, for example, what kind of work I do there, is that there's two working groups which I've been very active on, just data citation, which was really crucial for this ENVRI infrastructures. We need a way of really finding out how much our data is being used. So data citation is crucial. And our data is dynamic, so it's changing all the time. So how to do this kind of data citation for dynamic data? Ended up with these recommendations. And then lately we've been working on data versioning, what kind of strategies from my point of view in infrastructures, and this is usually in the infrastructures, actually, we are mostly interested about it. How do you approach the fact that you have different versions of data, and what is a version? Is it there's a lot of philosophical questions there as well. It gets into this super interdisciplinarity point of view. And now there's this kind of white paper and actually publication came up. So from actually on the right side, what I want to say, in RDA, usually you end up with a kind of core team of couple of people in the working group who are really active. And then you have this penumbra of other people who might contribute a little bit or give you data or participate otherwise. To me, at least, I think that in RDA, you don't really get really close to usually scientists. Scientists don't have time for that kind of philosophical and practical infrastructure work. There's really not really resources in RDA, but a lot of knowledge there. But the really good part about RDA is that it's global, and it really has this global reach and a lot of different kind of people. And actually, I've noticed that it's even more global now in the COVID times. So then the last one of the big acronyms in this whole webinar is European Open Science Cloud. And actually here, as you can see, it doesn't really connect to me that directly. It connects really to the ENVRI community. And this is because how I ended up there was through the ENVRI community and the point of view that the Commission really pushed for it, for also, and still keeps pushing it for the research infrastructures. And in here, it's a little bit different graph what I want to present here, which is a bit different than what Hilary showed before. And this was something that we used actually in ENVRI, in the EOSC Future project, which was mentioned in some of the preparatory phase. I don't think it ended up in the grant agreement or anything, but it just shows you at least my vision, how it looks right now with the EOSC, is that if you look this kind of service hierarchy, the center pyramid there, is that what EOSC is providing a lot, at least in the technical sense. It provides a lot of core services and a lot of effort has been made there. And I think that's great. You need a good foundation. And then there's some effort made, maybe this little red line there kind of shows, which is a little bit effort done on this kind of EOSC exchange, which is kind of middle level layer of services built on top of the EOSC core. And really not much at all done on the derived services, which is a little bit kind of backward, because the Commission, a lot of people think that the EOSC is the holy grail of all the scientists. But really, to me at least, I don't see a lot of scientists really personally connecting to EOSC core services. I see that they are mostly meant for the really kind of other kind of big organizations in a sense. I think that the role comes through these kind of middle level players there, including research infrastructures, who kind of translate the core services and some of the EOSC services into really specific derived services. And this should also come from the scientific communities and RPOs, universities, and so on, who built on top of these on the top of the core and maybe some of the EOSC exchange services. They build up their own virtual laboratories and their own services with a specific for the researchers, because you need this. I think that the more generic services, the less useful from the box it is for users. This is just kind of in general, not always the case, of course. So in the case, and again, these traffic lights, from my perspective, I kind of like working with some of the EOSC things, but it's very abstract often. And you're really talking often with very, very kind of generic things. The good part about it is that there is really an idea of shared resources. How that's actually going to end up with is another question, but at least it makes it possible. And at least it's the realization of this one is a bit question mark, but there's a possibility of these platforms which really form the core basis foundation. And from the global point of view, really the challenge is that it's European. Of course, there's these connections intended for international part, which Hilary also mentioned, but I think that it's by its nature, it's European, even though some people don't say that too much. So overall, I think that you come with this kind of core level service integration. And you can see that I am this annoyed academic here in the middle, but I think that I'm much less annoyed nowadays, or maybe annoyed about other things. But still, it's things are getting together. And so, as a final kind of thought graph, how do I see the roles of these ones? You saw those little logos what I used earlier. I think that the European Open Science Cloud is really there, which is the one for the resources. I see that ENVRI community on the research infrastructures, and actually also a lot of universities and other kind of research institutions on the bottom right, which really are more for the scientists, providing the services for the scientists per se, using the European Open Science Cloud. And the RDA is really working. The core of it is the international and this kind of multidisciplinary, a bit hand-wavy, but sometimes really technical approaches as well. And so they all help each other with different ways. And I think that this kind of, in a healthy ecosystem, you have these little boxes where different species exists. But of course, also in healthy ecosystem, you also have competition. So we'll see how healthy this will end up with. So I don't know how many minutes I used, but I think this is all what I wanted to present.
I think you were perfect. And actually, thank you very much for sharing your personal view, because I think that sometimes that's what we are missing in all these talks that we hear about EOSC and other initiatives. So I think this, or at least for me, was very useful to see how is your vision and how these initiatives can collaborate. So thank you very much. If you have any questions for Ari, maybe we can also pick them up in the panel. Let's move to the final speaker. That is my colleague, Heidi Laine. So Heidi is the Customer Solution Manager for the service area for data at CSC, IT Center for Science. And in the past 2 years, Heidi acted as coordinator of the RDA Finland node. And she's also involved in many other initiatives like the CODATA Data Policy Committee and the Finnish Committee for Research Data. Heidi, please.
Thank you. Let me get my slides on and let's start from the beginning. No, that's not the beginning. Sorry. So I hope everything works fine now. You hear my voice and see my slides. We're ready to go. Okay. So what I wanted to present you is a quick look back, because my disciplinary background is in history, so I like to do this kind of retrospective takes on things. I think it is important even when we are looking into the future to be aware of where we're coming from. So RDA Finland node was something that we had for a while. CSC hosted the RDA Finland node from I think early 2018 until last year. And then some of you might have wondered where did the node go? But in my view, it hasn't really gone anywhere. It was just one manifestation of the Finnish involvement with RDA. The national node, in its kind of formal manifestation, was part of an EU project, the RDA EU4 project, and CSC got funding through that project to coordinate this node. But both the Finnish research community and CSC involvement with RDA goes way back before that already. So here's a quick look, walk down the memory lane, a picture from the very first RDA plenary meeting in 2013 in Sweden. It's not my picture, and I wasn't there, but I think that we have here on this webinar at least a few people who attended that. I think Ari referred to being there, and Leif certainly was there as well, and I've been on board since the second plenary. So already during the first year of RDA, the Finnish membership hit 50 and has been steadily increasing since, and currently we are at 266 members, which is a nice number. We Finns like to compare ourselves to the Swedes, and just for reference, I checked the number of Swedish RDA members. It's 127, so nice work. A little bit more figures. So currently the EU membership at RDA is 6,000, and here in these pie charts you can see that we quite nicely punch above our weight. The Finnish membership is 4.4% of all EU members. So this is definitely an achievement that we can be proud of. But what has the impact of RDA been in the Finnish national research landscape, and especially in the open science landscape? It's not always so direct and easy to see, but I think nonetheless it has been very significant. Here we have the visualization of the declaration for open science and research in Finland that was developed by this National Open Science Coordination, and the way the Open Science Coordination has been organized it's got an inspiration from the RDA way of community management, and of course also the work done at RDA has had a significant impact in the work done at the Open Science Coordination, especially in the expert group focusing on research data issues. We've also held a number of community events throughout the years. Here is an example from 2019, which is especially dear to my heart, because that was the first RDA related event that I had the privilege to host and organize as the RDA Finland node coordinator. I had just joined CSC at the beginning of 2019, and one of my work assignments at the time was first work assignments was to start organizing this meeting and with the theme of sensitive data and focus on sensitive data, because that was one of the thematic focus of the RDA Finland node. And these events tend to kind of happen and then be forgotten, but nowadays we have the means to record these, and some of these events hopefully have a longer lasting impact. And for example, these events, the material is still online, and as many of you are aware, the theme of the topic of sensitive data management is more acute and actual than ever. And then, of course, one of the highlights that we should not, that is hard to bypass is the 14th RDA plenary that we had in Finland late 2019 in October, and it's at the same time it makes me proud and sad that it's to date the last RDA plenary that was able to be held as a face-to-face event, and it's one of, I dare say, one of the fondest memories of my professional life, that the plenary and the week. I think it was a great show of strength from the Finnish RDA community. But in order to not be overly positive and to also remember the critical aspects and where we can increasingly grow and learn. These are the targets that were set for the Finnish RDA node in the context of the RDA Europe 4 project, and most of them were achieved, but this output adoption has, in my view, been a challenge for the Finnish RDA community, and something that we could improve on as we go forward with our RDA involvement, because the RDA outputs are mostly of really great quality and could have a really significant impact on our policy work, and we've already during this webinar heard about the importance of policy alignment. So I hope that that's something that we can improve on in the future in this community. Why should we now that we no longer have these node activities, why should we hang on to RDA? I think it's for me it's a no-brainer. I mean, there have been already today great testimonies for the usefulness and importance of RDA. It's here's this triangle picture is from Barend Mons, he's the president of CoData, and it's already a couple of years old, and it shouldn't be taken as the truth. It's just here. I wanted to include it to kind of show that the need for these different organizations that bring different aspects, different ways of working and their own communities to the global stage and act together and as part of this ecosystem of organizations and discussion forums, and I feel like RDA brings something to the table that none of the other actors do, and that's the lively community and also the global point of view. And as we now kind of in Finland pass the torch from the RDA Finland node to the EOSC Open, the EOSC Finland Forum, I feel like the RDA connections are more important than ever, because it kind of puts the European discussions and developments into the global perspective and helps us move towards a global interoperability, because Europe is not the world. And we were asked to come up with a kind of a take-home message to end our speeches, and this is mine. If we didn't have RDA, we would have to invent it. I don't see any other community being able to move as agile as RDA has, for example, in this current crisis. We all already heard from Hilary about this important work done in order to create standards for sharing COVID-19 related data, and already that in itself, I think, is a great manifestation of the strength of the RDA, and something that we as Finns, the Finnish research community, we don't and we can't miss out. I feel like we are needed there on this global stage, and we definitely need this global perspective and community. Thank you. That's for me.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for bringing us and guiding us to the final panel. So just let me share this for a couple of seconds. So as I mentioned at the start of the webinar, we will be using Mentimeter during the panel. So my colleague will copy the information about the code and the link in the chat. So get ready to provide your input. And then here we come to the panel that will be really focusing on further exploring the synergies and the complementarities between RDA and EOSC. In the panel, we have Ari, Heidi, and Hilary that we have already met in the webinar. And the new entry is Anders Spark-Conrad. So I would like to introduce Anders. Anders is the head of the Data Management and Storage Department in DAIC, the Danish University's Cooperation and Research Infrastructure. In this role, he is the head of a working group preparing a national fair data management strategy, and is working in support of a portfolio of national data management services. He has also been a member of the EOSC Fair Working Group and is the DAIC representative in the EOSC Association. And he was also the coordinator of the RDA Danish node. So welcome, Anders. And last but not least, our rock star of the day, it's our moderator, that is Leif Laaksonen. As you heard from the others already, so Leif was the project director of the first RDA project in Europe. And as I like to call him, is one of the founding fathers of RDA, both in Europe and at global level. And in his career, he was also director at CSC Center for Science and chair of the Infrastructure Reflection Group. So Leif, I'm passing the floor to you for the panel.
Thank you, Sara, a lot for the kind words, and thank you for the speakers. I think all the speakers have, at least in my head, created mind-boggling ideas, and it would take hours to go through everything. But I think we have time for a few questions to the panel now in particular. And if I understood it correctly, we will have the Mentimeter, the first one after the first question, and we have about, I don't know, 35 minutes. So if we can have after 15 minutes, we can shoot out the first Mentimeter. And I think as a summary from what we have here today is clearly that we are on a journey of change. This is not something new. I think I've repeated it for years also, that we are going through a change. And That's obvious because the digitalization in the society in general has changed a lot of things, and that will definitely change also in science. And one of the things which came into my mind when I was listening, in particular to Hilary's first presentation, was that we are not really talking about merging RDA into EOSC or merging EOSC into RDA, but we are creating some kind of bridge now between these two entities for a platform where we can bring the strength from definitely both of these. And this brings me to my first question to the panelists. How do you see we can best create this bridge for this platform where we can make the best benefits from these two entities, the European Open Science Cloud and the RDA Global Initiative? And I pass the first, I think we start with the ladies. So if Hilary, you start first, and then we get Heidi after that. So, and please keep it quite short, because the shorter it is, the more we have time for discussion. But please.
Thank you, Leif. No, we're gone. If I may, I'd like to just say one thing. It brought tears to my eyes when Heidi put on her last slide, if we didn't have RDA, we'd have to invent it. I think it's the nicest, one of the nicest things I've ever heard about it, and a great tribute to the community. But so, yeah, I'm delighted that, you know, after all these years, Leif, it's just stronger and more important than ever. I agree with your point that we shouldn't merge the two. I believe that, interestingly, you know, the European Open Science Cloud, they've been talking about it in Europe for a long time. With the work that's being done in RDA specifically to support, if you like, that internationalization or the synchronization, not only the complexity at the start with this global open research commons group was even to define the wording, yeah, and to agree on a terminology that people would understand, if you like, because while we've been hearing about the Open Science Cloud for many years here in Europe, on a global level, it means different things, it's not quite the same, and things like that. So we certainly don't want to merge the two, but the point is that indeed science is global. It doesn't have geographical boundaries. I think everybody on the call said that. And so learning from each other and exchanging, and we would see in a pragmatic way that RDA could be an open platform for, if we want to say that the European Open Science Cloud is perhaps more advanced in certain areas respect to others around the globe, then isn't it a great forum for the definition or the resolution of those some of the challenges around it that others can then take up and implement. So, I mean, I see it going in, if you like, in a parallel and a synchronized complementary way. Short.
Okay, good. That was short and very prompt. Heidi, please.
Thank you. So the question was how to bridge RDA and EOSC. And if I don't know if I make justice to the question, but that's what I'm going to answer anyway. So one of the strengths and at the same time weaknesses of being a small country, a small community, is that we have a limited pool of people, limited number of individuals. So in Finland we have many people are wearing many hats. So of course from the point of view of the individuals, this can be quite tiresome. I mean, people are very can get overworked because they need to have juggle these several roles, but at the same time we have same people heavily involved with EOSC and RDA, so we have this like people as bridges, and even though, like I said, there are challenges, that's something that we we should and we can and we have taken advantage of, but yeah, continue to do so. Also about the point of not merging EOSC and RDA from the national point of view, the EOSC Finland Forum is an important new actor in this landscape, and I talked about this kind of passing the torch. But at the same time, I wouldn't like to see all Finnish RDA involvement going through being reduced to the EOSC Finland Forum. So I would like to see the universities being active and the National Open Science Coordination and the kind of the RDA being part of all types of activities in the national landscape.
Okay, thank you, Heidi. And I think Ari is burning to say something, so I will pass on the floor to him. Please, Ari.
No, I was thinking how much I agree with this, and I think especially the connection with the individuals between there is in Finland especially important. But I do see though that there is a lot of room for additional connectivity, and it can be also in a really from the RPO level as well. And so really thinking that if we want to do something which has international aspect and it has some level of connection to research data, I think including these ones also in the national level would be very useful. And of course, I'm not saying that every university should send their people to all the RDA meetings, but some of the technical staff and especially some of the kind of strategic development could really benefit from this kind of activity.
Okay, thanks, Ari. And Anders, you were left as the last one, not because you are the least important, but I think you can contribute from the Danish view very much as well. And I'm happy to meet you as well. So please, Anders.
Thank you, Leif, and thank you for inviting me. I'm certainly seeing it as a challenge you have made to merge RDA and EOSC into the same organizational setup, and I wouldn't play smart and say I have any key answers to how to make that work. We also in DIKE, I should say, we are as the introduction from Sara, we are involved both in EOSC Association and in RDA, and indeed in GoFair as well. So I can recognize that, but I probably think of EOSC mostly as a top-down initiative that's started from the Commission and that's very policy-driven. It's very much in the framework of, say, policy in the EOSC Association, the financial side of things, which we should not forget, all the money being poured into the infra-EOSC programs, in the projects, in the actually building parts of EOSC. That's the one side. And then I think very much of RDA and indeed of GoFair as a bottom-up process of the people, like Ari explains, who are really involved directly in their work in these issues, who need to have solutions, who need to move on with fair data and so on. And in that respect, I think RDA is providing a number of the actual building blocks that EOSC will build upon when it becomes one day less abstract, because I agree with the way Ari explained it, it's very abstract. So if you are into the concrete, go into RDA or go into GoFair and start making things work. If you really want to see the big vision unfold and involved in the policy, you should probably involve in the for instance, advisory groups of EOSC Association. So where they really merge to me is in the vision, like Hilary explained in the beginning, that there's very big overlap in this idea of a kind of commons that overarches from disciplines to and across nations. So I think that's probably the perspective to keep in mind to make this merging institution work.
Okay, thanks, Anders. I think you raised a very important thing, which is obvious, of course, but you don't always remember it when you deal with these. It's important to have a bottom-up as a top-down approach as well. And one of the things I think which was quite well reflected during the presentations is as well that the different science disciplines have different levels of ability to adapt new things, if I may put it this way, because in some science disciplines, they have very well established processes for dealing with things. And they are perhaps reluctant to adapt other things because they have been doing something for a long time already. And I would see this platform now being sort of built from when the bridge from EOSC to RDA is that there is a very strong bottom up, as you Anders said, in the RDA field. And could you panelists reflect a bit on how do you see from your point of view how this strong community knowledge could or should come up now, because I also feel that EOSC still suffers perhaps a bit from not having the close connection to the scientists. If perhaps this wasn't clear, so please ask me to be more accurate, but do you have reflections on this viewpoint as well? I can see, I don't know, Hilary. Oh, I give it to Hilary first.
Anders, but I've spoken lots. Let's listen to Anders.
Okay, Anders, yes, please, go ahead.
Well, I was just out of my sleeve now. Well, obviously that the EOSC Association recently had some webinars about how to form the new advisory groups, and that was definitely one of the topics that came up strongly, the need to integrate and really make something that's useful for scientists. I mean, you would think that's very obvious, but this is really something you have to work on. So the EOSC Association is aware of that as something that has to be probably included in the new advisory groups. That was how I understood the discussion. It's something they would look on when they put the people into those groups. That's one way, but I think it's a big issue, and otherwise I'm not quite sure how the workings are, and maybe Hilary definitely knows more about how the integration into projects, for instance, of RDA, and we heard of one but I could say I was in an EOSC working group in the earlier system, the EOSC FAIR working group, and in the reports that we made use of several outputs from RDA, very fundamental stuff. I was in the task force on persistent identifiers, very fundamental stuff on PID kernel information, on data type registries. The FAIR assessment group made use of the FAIR maturity. So by involving in these RDA groups, there's some way that stuff transpires into EOSC if you make good outputs and strong statements. So I would feel quite reassured that if you're a scientist and you're involved in how to build good infrastructure for your research field, it will have an impact also on EOSC, I think.
Hilary, do you want to continue on this?
Sure. I mean, just a couple of things. One is, I mean, Heidi mentioned it before, which is, of course, in the Research Data Alliance, how it works is there's a lot of knowledge, but there are no resources. So all of the work is done by a volunteer community. And we facilitate then that work and try and, the structure around it. But in its 8 years. You know, more or less the mechanisms that I showed at the beginning, the working and the interest groups are the ones that have, and they remain, and they're important. We have, of course, also ourselves to evolve with the changing landscape around us. And one of the things that we hope will support also the EOSC and other global commons is this new concept that we have, which is communities of practice. And they're looking into disciplinary and domain areas, if you like. So the idea there is, and it would be larger than the open science challenges, but also encompassing them. So going back to what Anders said, where he mentioned some of the, like the data type registries, and he gave a couple of, you know, the fair data maturity model. The idea is to look into and outside of RDA, or what are the challenges that these communities are facing. So we have two on their way to being launched, the infectious diseases and agricultural data. And so they serve as, if you like, a broader coordination to try and ensure that, first of all, the challenges within that scientific domain, which, as you said, Leif, are many and different, and then also to share with others, because that seems to be, Ari mentioned it in his presentation as well, this sort of super interdisciplinary aspect. So, I mean, one of the solutions is, or our ways of trying to support that. The other, of course, is in the wonderful community and scientific community spirit that at least I have seen. And there are many, many scientific and research communities that are in a better level or phase of preparedness to actually do something when this EOSC, as Anders said, is a little bit less abstract. And Timea's work, and then what we hope to continue to do in the project that should be launched, is to actually ask these communities. We will facilitate that to help us to be the lighthouses in up to a certain point for those communities that aren't as prepared and aware, because it should be for all, so that all researchers and you know, end users, and not just for some, but that's okay. There are some who can advance it, and others then that can join after.
Okay, I'll give you, Heidi, a short comment here before we go to the first Mentimeter.
Okay, thank you. So I feel like this question of researcher engagement is the kind of the holy grail of the research data management community and discussions. And I feel like not the solution, but one of them would be to engage universities even further into EOSC, into RDA. Universities as individual organizations, but also they have their own clubs, LERU, for example, or EUA in Europe. So through these organizations, perhaps we could better reach the researchers as well. I think Ari's slide where he was in the center, the annoyed academic, kind of highlighted this issue, because I kept looking at the University of Helsinki logo in the left-hand corner and expecting an arrow to appear there as well, but there wasn't one. So how could we get that arrow to appear? I think that would be an important thing.
I actually thought about it, but left it out.
Good. Okay, perhaps we can come back to this. This is already coming closer to the question too, but I would like to give the wording to Sara now for the first Mentimeter. We have still a few people online, so perhaps you could stick with the Mentimeter.
So actually, some people have already entered some inputs into our first question that was really related to the topics that might be more relevant for the audience perspective that are part of EOSC or RDA. So as we were talking about the potential links and bridges between EOSC and RDA, that's why we asked this question. And as you can see from the answer, so I mean, many of the topics have been addressed today, and some others are really part of the core activities that represent the potential collaboration between EOSC and RDA. So maybe I think, unless someone wants to comment on this, We can open already the next question while you go back to the panel, Leif. And I wanted to tell you that there is also a question in the Q&A for Anders. Oh. And the question is about if there are any scientists included in the EOSC Association Advisory Group related to scientific community engagement. I don't know, Anders, if you want to pick this up, otherwise I could say something on that.
Yes, please, Anders.
Yes, sorry, yes, I just have to understand the question, sorry. Can you?
So, I mean, the question, maybe I could say something about this. So, I mean, the question was if there are any scientists included in the EOSC Association Advisory Group related to scientific community engagement.
This is not to be answered yet because the groups are not formed yet, but I understood Karl Luyben, the chairman of the EOSC Association, that would be an important criteria that when they put the people in the groups. Indeed, there were scientists in the earlier executive group, working groups, but they were to some extent very dominated by the project participants, and that's something I understood we would try to avoid in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. That's also the same feedback that I heard from the association, that they really want to encourage more participation from the scientists and the research sector. Leif, back to you.
Thank you, Sara. I think we still have about 10 minutes time for another round, and some of you already touched a bit the subject of the role of the universities and institutes in the way they will be impacted by the changes in the field. And especially it's still unclear for very many people how they will be affected by all this. And so the second question in a way goes more into how do you see from your point of view how it will be, let's put it in a more easy way. How would you see that, what are the changes you expect to see now in the research communities and in universities through this EOSC being created and perhaps getting a less abstract view in supported by the RDA input, of course. And if we start in the reverse, which gives you, Anders, the first word again.
Okay, thank you. I'll refer here to Denmark, how we think of this in Denmark. And I should mention that I think it was it Hilary who said that from the beginning that everyone more or less has their own vision on EOSC. And in Denmark, the predominant vision has been to see EOSC as a vast data infrastructure. So it's very closely connected with the FAIR principles and an expectation that you make FAIR, you share your data through EOSC, then you get access to this vast pool of other people's data. So the FAIR practice is one of the main policy areas in Denmark, and that's why we're making now this strategy. But it'll be a huge cultural change for people, and some people are very well suited for that because those ideas of sharing data was not invented by FAIR principles. They were just structured by the principles. But for other disciplines, the resistance is very high, I have to say. So eventually there could be something very fantastic, but on the way we have also identified that it will be an initial investment for the first movers. They will have to make their data accessible and not get the vast pool of other people's data until there is enough amount of people doing the same. That's the one track. The other is for us is the infrastructure track. and we don't know really a lot yet about what EOSC will be like as an infrastructure. So we have to focus on the advice of the architecture group mainly, put persistent identifiers on all your objects whatsoever they are, use AI to make sure they can be accessed across. So build these step by step, because universities are not interested in the abstract. We cannot involve them very much in the abstract ideas or the big visions. They're all pressured for time. So they want to know how they can take step by step into this world of being integrated into EOSC.
Thanks, Anders. And Ari, you have a long history, so you should have a clear picture how you have been affected or infected by the digitalization. Please.
Well, I don't know how much. Well, I am of course affected, and it's also part of the research culture in general. But I would just like to return on the universities, because I've been actually right now quite active in my own university on this aspect. And what we have really, I think that how we will connect to the EOSC somehow is that it comes very clear that the university have a lot of individual services which are actually trying to answer this kind of fairness question, which is coming from basically from top down. You have a strategic decision of open science, and then the whatever parts of the university will build their own services on top. But what I'm really kind of lately been wanting is really from research perspective that why there isn't some tools which make your research so much easier. Because right now I'm talking at the same time to the researchers in my unit who have problems of where to put their data during their research time, and they don't care about the long-term storage. They only care about it during their project time. It comes from the top, the requirement of the rest. But what I can see there is that there is really a need of this kind of services which could kind of make the research easier, giving this kind of possibility, and then automatically making it openly accessible then, and which would then hopefully, and I really liked the presentation earlier about the incentives, is that if these ones would then automatically end up in your, we have this researcher database of their achievements, and it would come directly there without any extra effort. Because right now, and I think that this connection to these kind of international collaborations, which could help to build this kind of service platforms that this could work, I think that there is a lot of potential here. But I think that all this discussion that it's been top down, I completely agree, and it's also top down in the university level still. And we need to give a little bit more carrot than the stick, and we have to figure out what kind of services would make the current research easier, which could also be then implemented somehow into open science.
That's very concrete. Thank you, Ari. Heidi, do you have a view from a sort of a service provider's view, or perhaps from another view?
Yeah, my own probably. I think it's safest to speak as an individual here, not necessarily as representing all of CSC, although I hope my views align with those of my employers. I think the EOSC, from the point of view of research organizations that we too serve at CSC, it's ideally it could be a vast resource and something that is an asset, especially to kind of smaller communities and universities, to kind of ideally level the playing field in Europe and globally. But I think there's still long ways to go. But from a very kind of practical point of view, the EOSC for universities is something that whether they kind of like it or not, is something to take into account when building their own services and planning the service architecture. And from CSC perspective, we're kind of in the middle, in between the universities and EOSC, operating on the national level. So all of these levels need to be interoperable with each other. So that's like the
plausible. Sounds plausible. Thank you. And I think we are coming closer to the end. So Hilary, you can clean the table now with.
Thank you, Leif. It's interesting. I think it just in the short discussion, it goes to show, unfortunately, the levels of complexity that there are across all the different stakeholders. I think in true European style, though, it's very inclusive, the discussion, and hopefully with the establishment of the EOSC Association and other things that will only improve. I still go back to saying, of course, that there will be lighthouses, I think, that will need to be followed, particularly from both an organizational perspective as well as from a community perspective. But I do see, and I think Timea highlighted it in her brief presentation of a very interesting study that she and the Digital Repository of Ireland are doing for us about this, policy alignment and how it remains really challenging, and of course aligning the institutions. And we see this with the research assessment. Just imagine the whole EOSC, which is supposed to encompass all of that. So I think I'll stop and say my last word, which is, of course, I hope that we have convinced you. I have a nice African proverb that I often use, and that if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And I think this is, it will take time. There's lots of progress, but we have a long way to go yet, but we can do it together. So we could go far together.
Thank you, Hilary. And I think I will summarize with what you said in your presentation, or at least as I understood it from your presentation. And it's remarkable how difficult it is for doing an easy thing as knowledge sharing. And because you would think that knowledge sharing would be easy, but apparently it's not. And I think there will still be a lot of work to be done. And I want to thank you panelists for your remarkable input. It certainly was a good finish for the previous presentations that took us to this. And I see Sara already in her nice countryside, being eagerly waiting for carry us further. So thank you, panelists and speakers. And Sara, please.
Yeah, thanks, Leif. And I would like to thank you very much, you, for chairing this interesting, even short panel, but I think it was really nice. I would like to thank again all the speakers and also all the participants. Today we had around 55 participants. That I think it's great. I hope that this webinar was useful to shed some light on RDA and EOSC and how the two initiatives are working together. For me, it was very interesting, and my personal takeaway is that I think RDA could be really a precious resource for EOSC, on which EOSC can leverage on to move both from the development side, but also for the uptake side, which I think it will be one of the key points in the future. I'm also very happy that in this uncertain and complex landscape, there are some signals of positive feelings that something could really change or something concrete could be done. And I want to leave you all with this positive vibe to close this webinar. The last thing that I want to say, it's more about the future for the Finnish Forum. So just stay tuned, because we are launching this EOSC Finnish Forum Cafe, and we will have a couple of sessions on the week of the 13th of April. So we are going to replicate the same session, and this is really for the Finnish Forum members And we would like to have an informal chat with you about the latest updates from the EOSC Association. We are always asked about, should we join the association? Shouldn't we join the association? So we want to discuss this in a very informal way with all of you. And we will also discuss about the advisory groups. There was a question before, so we will give you some information about there. And of course, we will keep it very informal. Thanks a lot once again to all the speakers and panelists and to all of you. And actually, we are 2 minutes earlier. So if someone wants to say something, that's your time.
Thank you very much. Are pets also allowed to your coffee? Your cafe?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Because Ari, there's I'm afraid somebody missing today.
Yeah, well, he was mewing there in the meantime, but he's not right now.
Ari has a lovely pet that often joins us on meetings.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Sara and CSC and Ari, Anders, Leif. So wonderful to see you. Thanks so much.
It was a pleasure to see you. So hope you to
nice
see
meeting you live
again. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.